around the world, not just in our own societies in Europe and North America, but around the world. And that's a feature. And what has enabled that to grow, as we can see, global production of meat from below 50 million tons in 1950 to over 275 million tons, around 300 million tons today. With FAO proposals that we would perhaps need 465 million tons by 2030. The idea is that meat production will continue to grow because of the demand for meat. Now, meat production at scale brings with it a lot of significant disadvantages. We'll explore some of those in a little while. But what that has created is an opportunity for many people to eat meat on a regular basis, so that the average world consumption, global consumption, and of course this is, as you know, averages can be very misleading, can vary significantly, but an average per capita consumption of about 40 kilograms of carcass weight per year, per person. But, you know, over 100 kilograms per person is found in the United States, in Brazil, and in Spain. I understand Italian levels of meat consumption would be similar to Ireland, somewhere between 80 and 90 kilograms of meat per person. But of course, in order to produce meat at scale, we're talking about the production of feed crops. So dedicated crops that are produced simply for animal consumption. For poultry and for pigs, that means growing soybeans in large volume. Very large volume in Brazil, in Argentina, in the United States itself. And the outcome of those feeding operations are feeding then these concentrated animal feeding operations. So if we think about the metabolic rift, we can see that this creates big nutrient disparities around the world. We can see that problems of managing, if you have large numbers, thousands of cattle being fed in a feedlot, you create problems of manure management, waste management that needs attention. I'll return to that. Just before I leave the metabolic rift, I want to explore a couple of other ways that we can think about it more within the social realm. The first of those is what has been called stressed human metabolic states. In other words, the way in which the food system has enabled us to eat lots of food which in volume is not good for us. So we have become what's become available is a lot of what's called energy dense foods. Energy dense foods meaning, you know, small chocolate bars, cans of carbonated beverage, no brand names here, but small, intense, sugar-laden, very much lot of sugar, salt, saturated fats. And that has enabled us to grow in size, so that we've all become a little bigger. And that's created a worldwide problem of overweight, obesity, and ill health. This is the issue, is that ill health is rising as a consequence of rising numbers of people that are overweight. So that speaks to the question of stressed metabolic states. There are a couple of other brief ways I'll speak about this, but I won't speak about them today, but just to, I hope, maybe think a bit about that. One is, some of you may have heard about this idea of a national food sovereignty. There's a lot of work that's being done here in FAO around this idea of the notions of food sovereignty. How do we reclaim our, if you like, our food cultures from this globalized process of change which has been going on around the world? How do we enable small farmers to re-establish the integrity of their farming systems rather than being dominated by industrial pressures? There's a lot of process going on, you know, global trade rules and so on that force those changes. So a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. The second question might be in regard to the ways that diets have changed. Again, under the influence of various powerful corporations who have worldwide interests. We could say one good example could be Nutella for example. I was using this yesterday. Nutella, that you probably regard as a wonderful product that is probably quite healthful, but you like to spread it on your tostado in the morning and no problem. But it's become a worldwide product, and many other people think the same way as you. This is fine. But the cumulative consequences of this are very significant in terms of the amount of land required to produce palm oil, which is about 35% of the ingredient of Nutella. The other 45%, or around half of Nutella, is made up of sugar. So just in case you think it's a healthy product, it's absolutely not. But those kinds of changes mean that people that would never have heard of Ferrero before or Nutella now have it available. It's becoming a ubiquitous process. So in that respect, we're looking at these kinds of changes that are taking place internationally. Now, we're coming to nitrogen, which is our key issue. And I should say straight away that one of the key questions is that, as we found with von Liebig, nitrogen is a constraining variable, a constraining factor in crop growth. In other words, farmers want to apply more nitrogen. It's needed in greater quantities even than phosphorus and potassium, though those are important macronutrients too. I've spoken about this process of moving to the cities, this urbanization that began to take over in the 19th century, and that's a process, of course, that we're finding worldwide. You might think, well, hang on, many of the needs of nitrogen were met by legumes, by cover crops, by green manures and so on that used to be widely used as part of a fourfold rotation together with sheep and so on. But of course, what we have to remember in those nitrogen fixing legumes is the fact that they take up land that couldn't be grown for producing cereals for human consumption. Now, this 19th century issue of finding a solution was something that people spend a lot of time thinking about. The agricultural chemists in their laboratories, and also we have Alexander von Humboldt, who's of course one of the most distinguished geographers of any era. Von Humboldt brought back to Europe a lump of Peruvian guano, and guano is concentrated seabird waste, right? So their droppings accumulated on these islands off the coast of Peru. And they were able to accumulate because the coast of Peru is a desert. It receives barely any rain. So the nitrates in that guano did not leach out. They stayed intact. And so what happened was that once it was discovered that this was such an effective resource, there was a huge trade in Peruvian guano, seabird droppings, brought back to Europe, also to the United States, something of the order of 600,000 tons at the peak per year. But of course, it was a non-renewable resource, and it collapsed as a resource by 1872. There remains still a problem of trying to find, how do we replenish this nitrogen onto the soils? And so Chilean nitrates help to bridge that gap. And then, of course, we've got the expansion of the North American grasslands, the prairies of Canada, also being turned over to farmlands, also producing grain, and that began to alleviate Europe's need to feed people, because it began to import large quantities of grain from the 1870s, 1880s, also from Argentina and so on. But that's only about mining stored fertility in those grasslands. Once you've exhausted that, you have to find ways of replenishing that fertility. And that's an issue that remains an obstacle for us. How do we maintain the integrity of soils to produce lots of crops for human consumption? This is the solution. The solution is the Haber-Bosch process. We're breathing 78% of the atmosphere that is surrounding us. 78% of that is made up of nitrogen. N2. Nitrogen. But this is non-reactive. We can't find a way of actually fixing that in the soil. So we have to find ways of capturing it, synthesizing it into a reactive form. And following von Liebig, there were a succession of German scientists working on this issue. How can we create a technology that would be able to create this reactive nitrogen? And probably the first person to have done that was Fritz Haber, and his experimentation was about capturing and synthesizing atmospheric nitrogen to create ammonia, NH3. And so from 1913, industrial production of ammonia first began. Now, unfortunately, 1914 marks the beginning of the First World War, and all that ammonia was then used to produce explosives for the First World War. That was a problem. So instead of it being used as an agricultural fertilizer, it becomes diverted for explosives. 1920s, there's a process of gradual ramping up of production, and that's happening as part of the Versailles Treaty. The Germans have to provide some advice and technology transfer, first to France and to other countries, to the United States and so on. By the end of that decade, there was less than 1 million tons of ammonia being produced, in which increasingly natural gas becomes the feedstock for doing this work, because you need an energy source, obviously, to do that. I should say there's an interesting Italian story, a narrative to this, because Luigi Casali was the first scientist to establish a plant in Umbria in 1929. So that was the first, if you like, ammonia plant using the Haber-Bosch principle established in Italy. Of course, after that, we go through the depression of the 1930s, everything sinks. We have also then war, which begins to want to use more explosives again, and that diverts all those nitrates that could otherwise be used. But from the 1950s, we see this incredible rise of production of ammonia for the purposes of agriculture. And what comes in this wake? This is important. The Green Revolution of the 1960s, the development of these so-called miracle seeds, high-yielding varieties of rice and of wheat, become very important. In fact, the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, a plant scientist, said chemical fertilizer, was the energy that enabled or the fuel that enabled the Green Revolution to take place. So it was about seeds, but it was also about fertilizers. And so those seeds were designed and developed to be fertilizer responsive. So as a consequence, we begin to see increasing volumes of fertilizer being produced and being applied to fields, not just in Europe, not just in the United States, but in India, in other parts of Southeast Asia, in Latin America. And you can see by 1999, we're beginning to see, very large volumes, 160 million tons of fertilizer being produced. And so over this period, over this half century, 1950 to 2000, nitrogen fertilizer use increased more than 20 times. I mean, this is wonderful. This is a way of solving the metabolic rift that Marx talked about. There is no longer a problem of soil fertility. It's solved. People can live in the cities. Their sewage can be collected and disposed of. It doesn't need to be returned to the land. We have the Haber-Bosch process. However, of course, as you would expect me to say, there are issues in using that. And that's what we'll look at. But you can see here the steep rise in total fertilizer use. This one is nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium to a lesser extent. But of course they are combined together in a form, often superphosphate and so on, providing the balance of those three key elements. So very significant increase in demand. Now the issue then is, how significant is it? Well, there's a distinguished geographer based at the University of Manitoba called Václav Smil. Smil, S-M-I-L, has written, he manages to produce 2 books a year. He's a remarkably productive man. And Smil has done some extraordinary work on looking at the whole science of this. His argument, as I said incorrectly in the abstract, was that not only would about 40% of the world's population could not survive without the existence of the Haber-Bosch process of atmospheric nitrogen synthesis. It simply wouldn't be possible to create enough food to support 7.3 billion people today. He thinks the ceiling would rest at somewhere like 3, perhaps 3.5 billion people. So perhaps half the world's population couldn't survive without nitrogen fertilizer produced by the Haber-Bosch process. It's a very dramatic finding. Let's be clear. We're able to flourish in numbers because there is food that helps us survive. That's absolutely clear. And we thought we had escaped the Malthusian iron law of Thomas Malthus and the link between, resources and population, that we were somehow beyond that. But the key that keeps us beyond it is the Haber-Bosch process. That's the key to this process. This is why I think I find it so fascinating that nobody has looked at this before, which is why I'm thinking about this. Now, in some ways, we have to understand what's the dietary contribution of nitrogen, because, of course, nitrogen is essential for plant growth. It's especially important for the synthesis of amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. So plants create protein. Every aspect of their tissue, and their plants require nitrogen to grow. I'll move through this quickly because this is less impressive in terms of these statistics, but there are figures to underpin what I'm saying in terms of applications. We're looking at minimum applications of in excess of 220 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in order to achieve reasonable crop outputs. Now, clearly, there is a significant variation in how much plants take up the nitrogen that's made available to them. Often farmers have been encouraged to use more fertilizer in the hope that it would increase yields. You can see there is a relationship between nitrogen applications and plant growth, but it doesn't mean that that goes on forever. Of course, there are limits to how much plants can yield, but farmers have often used more fertilizer than perhaps is optimum, and as a consequence, a great deal of that fertilizer is lost into the environment. Let me also be clear that alternative cropping involving legumes and green manures and so on couldn't, at the very best, could only fix, at best, 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So we're beginning to be able to create more reactive nitrogen through these other means. And so SMEAL, my source for much of this, a lot of the important stuff, speaks of the amount of fixed nitrogen that has been established by the Haber-Bosch process. Now, 2/3 of the world's fertilizer is not being used in the developed, rich world. In some ways, we've already reached a saturation in that respect, and looking to find ways of reducing it. It's the low and middle income countries where there's greater applications in the search for higher yields of food output. The other thing that we have to remember is increasing volumes of fertilizer applied to animal feeds, so that those animal feeds can then be fed to animals, to livestock, to produce meats and dairy and so on. What are the environmental consequences of all this nitrogen? This is surely a good thing. Well, if we say that less than half of all nitrogen, and I have figures that vary between different farming systems, I won't worry about those at the moment, less than half of all applied nitrogen is often taken up by crops. In some systems, a good deal less than half, really low, we're talking 20, perhaps 25%. And that means the other half is lost, and what we call anthropogenic. It's because we are fixing that nitrogen, we are providing it. It's not coming from natural processes. And what happens with that nitrogen is that it cascades along different pathways, leaching into the groundwater, so that it can, create nitrate pollution of groundwater. It can find its way into freshwater and coastal ecosystems, creating eutrophication, creating anoxious environments, can create dead zones. You might know at the mouth of the Mississippi there's a big dead zone created every spring because of the amount of nitrates that are washed off through the Mississippi. Biodiversity loss is also an issue. When some of this nitrogen is then volatilized into the atmosphere, either directly from the soil surface or through the plant, that process means that nitrous oxide is then taken up into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It has a global warming effect, a global forcing effect, 297 times that of carbon dioxide. It's a powerful greenhouse gas. There are multiple consequences for human health as a result of this. Don't worry about these figures again, because I'm looking at what are the planetary limits and what are we doing. You can see if we think of a limit below 100 teragrams, then we're exceeding that by at least a factor of 50 or 50%. So it's a very significant problem. And of course, it's not just a global issue, a planetary scale. We're also thinking about the way this has regional consequences too. This is where I want to be. The planetary boundaries idea is work that's been done at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, led by, in this case, by Johan Rockstrom and colleagues working there. And this is an important diagram, and it's actually been revised and updated and so on. I like this original version because it's clear. And you can see on this, and this is a very important diagram, this is a nub of what we're going at. Because what they do in this diagram is identify 9 environmental processes that they think are really critical to Earth system integrity, to Earth system functioning, the life on Earth as we know it. Some of these are not problematic. You may know that stratospheric ozone depletion was once a problem. It's less of an issue now, today, and that's because governments cooperated to address that. Climate change, you know, is an issue. We're in probably exceeding our safe operating limit in climate change. Biodiversity loss, people are aware that we're probably going through the 6th great extinction, the biggest extinction of life on Earth today than we faced for the last 160 million years since the age of the dinosaurs. But this one, nobody knows about this one. Nobody says, nitrogen? How's that an issue? This is an issue which we really have to convey to people that this is something that's very significant, right? And give me another 5 minutes of your time and we'll be through the worst, right? But nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle, what they call biogeochemical cycles, the way that we change the behavior of this element passing through the planet's ecosystems is very significant, is majorly been disrupted. See, this is where we're talking about another metabolic rift in the realm of nitrogen. But agriculture and the food system is a major contributor to this, as a contributor to this, and certainly land system change, certainly that freshwater use. So all of these things that are beginning to start to come up to their planetary boundaries, the food system is contributing towards very significantly. And it's one that we're not thinking about sufficiently. So it's a contributor, and we're not preparing ourselves adequately. Just to be very clear about what I'm going to be talking about just in our last 5 minutes, if I can, is that when we think about the amount of land we have on Earth, of the 71% of the planet which is habitable, 50% of that is given over to agriculture. And of that 50% of the world's surface given over to agriculture, 77% is given over to livestock. 77% is given over to livestock as pasture and as growing areas for feedstuffs in order to be able to produce meat and dairy. Only 23% of the world's agricultural land is used for growing crops that we eat directly. Wheat to make bread, wheat to make pasta. And that means that's a big issue. And of course, it's of these 23% of crops, they're providing us with 83% of our calories directly. And 67% of our proteins. So we think that we have to have livestock products to get our proteins, forgetting, in fact, that plants adequately provide a lot of our protein. So planetary boundaries in the food system are vitally important. Given that we know that agriculture contributes such a significant amount of global anthropogenic nitrogen, given the changes in the food system which have caused livestock to be taken off the land and used in rotations, providing their manure as they did in the past, we have now created specialized units fed by soybeans and other things brought thousands and thousands of kilometers, from South America to feed them. And increasing amounts of even breadbasket countries are growing feedstuffs in the United States and in Spain. In Spain is interesting because they have been through huge dietary change in the last 50 years. And whereas they would have used 100% of their wheat in the past to produce bread, now it's only 40% for direct human consumption, 60% is fed to animals. And they're bringing in, again, huge volumes of soya to feed pigs and the pork industry and so on. What it means is we create these regional imbalances in nitrogen as well. They build up in soils and they build up through aquatic ecosystems as well. And I'd be arguing that it's the scale of the global animal feed sector which is creating these huge, big nitrogen imbalances around the world. And that's something we have to pay attention to. And when we think about producing food to feed animals rather than using that food to feed ourselves, we could eat those soybeans. We could make tofu out of them. I know you think, I'm not going to eat tofu in place of a chicken burger or some other kind of form of meat. But actually, of course, there is a conversion inefficiency as those animals convert that foodstuff, that plant material, into meat. Poultry, chickens, of course, are more efficient given their size, but they still require 4 times more protein than they can convert. Pigs, take up about 10, only make about 10, convert 10 to 15%. In beef, it's of the order of 5 to 8%. So all of the rest is lost to the environment. All of that is lost as material and as manure that can't necessarily equally be found. So I have to ask the question of, is this the most effective way of feeding people? And just to remind ourselves, if we were to imagine our average daily protein requirements, plants are providing nearly all of it in different countries. The lowest, of course, the United States. In North Africa and the Middle East, plants provide more than the average daily requirement, and they almost do in much of Africa. Now, we choose to displace a lot of our plant-based proteins to eat meat, but it's not entirely necessary. But this is not a case to say you should all become vegetarian. It's just a question of thinking this through, of how we're trying to get a better balance, better equilibrium in the way that we do this. So if we were to look at, different countries around the world and the way that their trajectory in meat consumption, we can see that everywhere it's been going up very dramatically. Yes, the United States eats more meat than anywhere else, but there's lots of countries where the European Union is there, Brazil is catching up, and China has been increasing very rapidly as well. So all of these countries also have enjoyed a growing appetite for meat, with implications for the nitrogen cycle. So, we're at the last slide. In some ways, the question is that I've been struggling with, and it may not have worked for you, but the metabolic rift as a metaphor, does it capture something that we're trying to work through? Will it help to capture our imaginations? Maybe we don't need to speak of the metabolic rift. Maybe the data is sufficient in itself to understand the sheer scale of the problem that we have. The question is, though, what can we do about changing our eating practices? That's the big million-dollar question. How are we going to use that information about the impact of the meat system, the livestock system, to change our eating practices? Is there a way that we can find new ways of decoupling our nutritional needs without having the same environmental impacts? Is there a way of finding technical solutions that would reduce our loading of nitrogen into the environment? I mean, we could say, Is there a way of improving the conversion efficiencies of animals? And of course, people are working on that all the time, breeding programs and so on, but they are finding very marginal improvements. You're talking about a significant improvement would be of the order of 5 to 8%. That's not achieving the radical changes that we really need to find if we're going to claw our way back into keeping with planetary boundaries. Agronomic practices also are being looked at. Smart practices by spraying nitrogen fertilizer when the plants most need it, but only in the quantities that are required. Those all require a much more specialized and technically competent form of agriculture, which is not necessarily always the best form that we have to fit the way in which agriculture is practiced worldwide. So ultimately, my reading of this literature is that and people are coming at this from places that you wouldn't really think that they would be sympathetic to this, but the evidence would suggest it's only by reducing our meat intake that we can begin to start to find ways of achieving the levels of reduction of nitrogen, which is so significantly interfering with these planetary biogeochemical cycles. And that will require us, of course, to be engaged in a very significant piece of work, both in scientific realm, but also in our society. So that process needs to continue. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Sage. Well, I think you've been so good in showing how geography is a real transdisciplinary approach to the study of life on Earth. Now let's come to the questions. I have my own question, but I think it's too stupid, so maybe I let them raising the first questions. We can have a couple of questions and then your answers. Then again, 2 questions and your answer. So, is there any question on this very important issue, or comments, remarks, even scientific assessment? Why not? Please. Just what I have to ask you is to come here, because we have the streaming on the internet. So please come here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Stefano Grego. I'm a former professor at university in soil science and the relationship between soil and environment, mainly. You touched so many points that it's difficult to make only one question. But anyway, I think there are 2 major points. One is how to rationalize the system. Is it true that we need so much food to produce? I mean, in these days, we're always talking about overproduction and wastes, and also a very difficult way to understand why we have to press the soil to produce more. In the International Year of Soil, 2015, we decided actually if we rationalize our attention to the soil, we can produce more than 79% of food. So it's a question of rationalization of our agriculture. I'm an agronomist, and my professor a couple of centuries ago was telling me that use as much nitrogen you can because it's very cheap and plants can pick up. We know now that it's completely wrong. The second question is people. We had to say to people, careful, what are you doing? Aldo Leopold, between the two wars, I'm sure you know, he was saying that the major problem for agriculture is that people think that food is coming from the supermarket. But this is still true. They don't understand why and how food is produced. So, I have many other questions about nitrogen. When you add nitrogen to the soil, I published papers on this, you have production of CO2. So not only you use nitrogen, but you produce CO2. And this is, is one of the major problems of the climate change and all the questions. So really, Colin, thank you for your speech. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Florence Segal. I work on sustainable food system and territorial approaches, urban-rural linkages. I think that was a very, very interesting presentation. But I think when we're talking of changing eating practices and seeing how consumers are actually going to change their lifestyle and what they eat, there is a variety of entry points that's already working. So it does seem that having an alliance of these different constituencies would really be the most effective, because I can think, of course, nutrition, everybody says too much meat, particularly red meat is not good for your health. Then you've got all the climate change work that has been done on seeing how you can reduce greenhouse gas emission, and of course part of it is getting rid of animal production, well, part of animal production. And then you've got all the animal welfare lobby. So I think that right now the people are hearing you shouldn't eat that much meat, right, left, and center. And the problem is more, can we perhaps have an alliance and see, maybe according to the cultures or the timing of the entry point, one maybe the preferred approach, and then broaden this perspective. So if you talk to scientists, maybe they're going to be interested in that mostly, soil scientists. But if you're going to talk to livestock producers, so I think that was more of a comment than a question.
Yes. So both of those, I appreciate the comments, and both very perceptive. With regard to the second comment around the constituencies, in some ways I shortened and condensed and somewhat simplified the question of the complexity of how we're going to change diets. It's no doubt that this is going to be met with extraordinary resistance. And one of the issues that arises, of course, is that there's going to be a way of wanting to polarize the debate very quickly. As I've faced myself in the kind of public realm where you're trying to have these conversations, you know, the kind of output is that you're trying to make us all vegetarians. I don't want to be a vegan. The question about finding a more nuanced middle ground where we begin to retrench meat consumption in the north, but still find space for countries that are still in an early stage of growth and development would benefit from enhanced meat consumption to improve their dietary status. We've got to kind of look towards ways of creating some kind of global convergence, which enables us to reach a satisfactory, globally manageable level. That means conversations across those boundaries between north and south, and between the experts that occupy both, and between the different social groups and civic societies. It's clear that we need people to lead these debates and discussion. Often they're, you know, as I say, media doesn't often treat these issues with the respect that they deserve, which is why we have to speak with each other about these kinds of practices. We have to find ways of perhaps enrolling, if we can, the kinds of spokespeople that tend to kind of have some certain currency at any one time, whether they're celebrity chefs that can roll out kind of ideas around this, or whether they're rock stars. I don't really care, actually. The important thing is, can they communicate a message about change and doing things, you know, that looks to be more cool and that can begin to get through whatever way it is to facilitate this kind of a conversation. So I think that question of constituencies is very important. And yes, as well, I simplified. I decided not to speak anything about the question of waste and surplus. It's already built into our food system. We're throwing away anything between 40 and 50% of all the food that we produce. We have to find ways of improving that situation straight from the get-go. I mean, it's the low-hanging fruit of the global food system. We should be, you know, working on addressing that from the very beginning. So there are a lot of ways that we can begin to start the process, actually. But it does mean some of the vested interests that are behind the existing order are going to have to change their way of working, and that means us putting pressure upon them to do that, I think.
Thank you, Colin. You also answered to my question that I didn't raise. It was about meat consumption and vegan and these lifestyles. So, any question, please?
Thank you very much. Enjoyed your presentation, both conceptually and also with the data. One specific question or concern I noticed in your presentation. You said, well, nitrogen and the green revolution helped to feed half of the world population.
Yes.
Well, if you take it globally, probably it's true. But then it's a very, very sort of distorted sort of question, in the sense that, yeah, we have still almost 1 billion people hungry, and most of the Hungaries are still remaining hungry. Yes, we did produce a lot of food, but as you said yourself, most of it is wasted. If you put aside the waste, a lot of food is also wasted by becoming more obese and bigger. So it is not really totally balanced, in the sense that the food production and the success in the green revolution is necessarily health, food security, and food issues. So it is creating at the same time a lot of problems related to obesity and problem, aside from environmental stuff. But also it does not really bring about the right people who need the food. So the distribution is a very important question. Thank you.
No, thank you. That's very good.
So I'm not able to go into details, but I'm happy that I may have not able to go into technical details, but I'm happy that there are experts in the room able to do that. Would you like to have your question? Thank you.
My name is Maria Fonte, University of Naples, Federico II. It's quite. I'm also a rural sociologist, and so I deal with the topics of the food system. It's very interesting that what is coming out from the debate, from the presentation, is that to change, I think, consumption habits, consumption practice, food consumption practices, we need to change the food system, actually, no? It's not only that is sufficient or that an individual behavior of the consumer, but a lot of the consumption practice derives from the way the food system is organized. So I would like you to comment on this, if this is true, on one. And the other thing is the role of policies in the configuration of this system. I think that are very important, because we think to change, because for what I studied, there are many initiatives from the grassroots that try to change the food system. All this movement of local food is quite widespread. I think people are very sensitive, but at the same time there are strong resistance from the top, I would say, and that is from the agricultural policy, government policy, and the configuration of the food system. So
be the last question. If is there any more questions, please? So now we stop with this one. Thank you.
My name is Maria Grazia Quieti, and I'm the program director of the Master in Food Studies at the American University of Rome, where we have invited Colin Sage. Colin, I have two issues. One is you only tackled briefly the nutrition transition.
Yes.
So what we are talking about in terms of reducing meat is very widespread. I teach Americans, and Americans are very aware of this, American students, and they take this into their diets, in their education. USDA does guidelines, etc. But we have to take into account the fact that developing countries are at a stage where they want more meat.
Yes.
So there is a discrepancy in the world about the consumption of meat and what's going to happen. And the other question was, why is it that an issue like this is neglected? The problems of interdisciplinarity. The agronomists know this very well. Social scientists like you that go beyond the narrow confines of their discipline touch on these topics, but otherwise, why is it that it's not doesn't come out more as a problem studied by different disciplines?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to all three for those insightful comments and questions. Perhaps I'll take them in reverse order, with Maria Grazia first. The question of the nutrition transition is a process long established. The work of Barry Popkin and others have looked at the way in which diets have been transformed around the world. The drivers for that transformation are really the very largest and transnational food corporations, who are really being very much able to open up. It's part and parcel of a globalization agenda that we've had in the world, where most governments have bought into or have been forced to accept this idea of reducing tariffs on trade and accepting foreign direct investments and the opportunities that has for creating jobs and investment. But it's brought with it significant cultural change in the ways that people eat. And so the nutrition transition is regarded as something of a double-edged sword. But on the one hand, people like to adopt new ways of eating if they can, particularly if they're cheap and particularly if they're tasty. But on the other, it's brought with it, in some countries, a crisis of type 2 diabetes and, ill health. And countries are having to deal now with this double burden of malnutrition in some parts of the population and excessive overweight and ill health associated with diet-related diseases on the other. And so there remains this discrepancy, yes, in terms of meat consumption, but that's in some ways narrowing as countries like China and India increase their consumption of meat. And I suppose the issue is that people are looking at this, they're not clear about how we begin to address this at a global scale. It may well be that these things are confronting economic interests, powerful economic interests. I mean, really powerful economic interests are behind maintaining the status quo. And we need governments to really come on board in this regard. And this is perhaps what Maria Fonte was suggesting. Where are policies? Well, governments have been willingly, allowed big companies to basically say, look, you're doing a good job, let's go ahead and produce the food. And we'll take a back seat. So there's been a vacating of the public realm as governments have retreated from that kind of area. It's all part of our, what we speak of as neoliberalism, but it's part of an era we've been going through, which is in contrast to the kind of, you know, era that immediately follows 1945, 1950 and so on, when governments had a big role to play in the public realm. And now we see governments needing to retreat and let the market decide in the interest of consumers. But that's where civil society can actually begin to open up its space. And Maria is completely correct when we begin to start to see these, you know, millions of initiatives, grassroots initiatives, that are beginning to take shape around the world, concerned with, you know, working with local farmers, finding ways of addressing hunger in towns and villages and cities in their, you know, all sorts of different initiatives. And as you were saying, I mean, I'm involved in running one in Cork, the Cork Food Policy Council, and we're by no means unique. There are plenty of examples where people are coming together and beginning to engage in activities locally. It's through that, I agree completely, that it's through that local level activity where we're going to see change. Fundamental change in people's minds, fundamental opportunities for people to begin to adopt new practices, bit by bit. And I suppose in that I would be hopeful. But it's long term and it's about building from below. But we do need governments to pay attention to this, and gradually, I think, and belatedly, they're doing so. And they're doing so where they're required to in climate change requirements, but they will have to be pushed into intervening in other areas too. And then Parvu's mentioned this, I think, very interesting question about the Green Revolution. And I've never been known of speaking positively about the Green Revolution before. And I have to say that, having said that, I did feel myself somewhat thinking, this is not what I really feel. Because I recognise all of the consequences associated with the Green Revolution, the pushing of people off the land, the changes in labour practices. I mean, but I suppose you cannot help but say, in this respect, nitrogen did react with those high-yielding seeds to do the job. But the fact is that why food security is not just about producing more food, is there's still a billion people that are hungry. They're food insecure. Demonstrates you're absolutely established. And so to get everyone fed well means that we have to rethink what we're doing on the grounds. But we have to do that not just in the realm of production and rethink, are there ways of restoring and recovering agricultural knowledge that has been passed down for several thousand years from farmer to farmer, from mother to daughter, and to retrieve those kinds of knowledge systems and the seeds that they had that are going to be soon lost if Monsanto has its way. If there's a way of helping us to maintain that, allowing industrial agriculture to carry on, but in a way that finds efficiencies, and begin a process, I think, of enabling agroecological solutions to be given greater space to provide better resilience for our food system above all else. So there's a lot of work that needs to go on in the realm of production in terms of thinking about the kinds of agricultures that we need. They need to be much more diversified. We need to be diversifying our food crops enormously in order to achieve nutritional security. But we have to also think about the realm of consumption, and what people are putting into their mouths is important. And we have to think, and it's connecting those two parts of the food system, which I think hasn't been done before. And if it requires people to think in a transdisciplinary way to do that, as you were suggesting, then I think that's why we need that greater collaboration. And I think that will be a solution to our predicaments going forward.
So thank you, Colin. Now we are at the end. I'm asking Maria Grazia Queti if maybe she should like to say something on behalf of the American University of Rome.
Just a few words. I'm proud to, first of all, I'm proud to be a member of the Società Italiana di Geografia. I'm a member of the Italian Society of Geography. So that's why we have this initiative. And I'm glad that we could do this with Colin. And Colin being a geographer, it seemed natural to me to invite him at this, in this beautiful institute. And just for those of you who don't know, the American University of Rome runs bachelor programs and master's programs, and which are accredited by US institutions. And I'm responsible for the Master in Food Studies, which is an interdisciplinary master's degree where we look at policies on sustainable production and consumption. So we look at both aspects of production and consumption. So thank you for hosting us here. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks for coming and for your attention. Okay, bye.